Hey guys, it's Mauricia Mullings, and I will be reviewing Johnston Chapter 6, What is Reasoning? So, the chapter begins with Bridget, a BCBA who has been working with Alan for the past 2 years and has seen his growth. He had self-stimulatory behavior and tantrums, also a limited social repertoire. All in all, Alan was progressing. His rudimentary reasoning skills were improving because he was able to converse about the sequencing of objects and pictures and finding the differences and similarities in sets. Bridget needed to know how could she help Alan improve his ability to reason about events and circumstances in his life and figure out how to solve problems, large and small. This is from Johnston, page 118. More than verbal behavior, being able to hold a conversation requires the ability to reason. I think even being able to argue about something you care enough about requires the ability to reason. Johnston writes, our ability to reason, whether in small private moments or carefully displayed in public venues, seems the zenith of human intellect. These assessments are themselves verbal behavior and should not encourage us to assign reasoning any special qualities or status, even as we acknowledge it is no more than behavior. Although this is something that happens intellectually, it is under the umbrella of verbal behavior. The proposition. Johnston quotes Skinner's Verbal Behavior, 1957. By way of explanation, consider the proposition the basic component of reasoning. In everyday terms, a proposition is what we know, believe, think, judge, or assume. Basically, anytime we say something about what we know, it is a form of verbal behavior, specifically called tacts. Verbal responses that are always reinforced when in the presence of an object or event or a property of that object or event. A perfect example would be when you are shopping with a friend and you both are looking at shoes, and the shoe itself you are looking at is the only thing you need a response for. Then it's a pure tact. If you want to go deeper and talk about a property of the shoe, for example, its color, then that would be called an abstract tact. Johnston states that our proposition takes tact one step further by connecting different forms of tact within an additional verbal response. This, the assertive autoclitic. Basically, when you insert is, as in the shoe is red, you are confirming something and you want the listener to agree. Tacts relate verbal behavior to nonverbal features in our environment. Johnston, page 119. Quantifying autoclitic is when a proposition includes tact, which may be a shoe, some shoes, the shoe, etc. Quantifying autoclitics modify the listener's reaction. Now we're going to go to premises and conclusions. This section reminds me of what politicians do, where they will improve their chances of the audience agreeing with them when they first emit propositions that will be more widely accepted. These more acceptable and believable ideas are called premises. Lawyers use premise all the time when trying to convict someone of a crime. They will try to convince the jury that someone is guilty by placing them at the scene of the crime and showing evidence that makes them look guilty, even if it's far from what actually happened. This reminds me of when people say it's not what it looks like, or believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm sure you guys have heard of these sayings before. Johnston says, reasoning is a colloquial notion that evolved in our language without the benefit of a scientific understanding of its foundation and operant behavior. Its highly varied usage in everyday talk does not consistently identify discrete response classes or patterns of behavior. Reasoning is merely verbal behavior that influences the probability that listeners will accept certain propositions. Johnston, page 121. Next, we're going to slide into logicality and rules. Johnston says, sometimes tacks of behavioral patterns or regularities result in statements called rules. He uses grammar as an example. Another example would be table manners. Rules often originate as descriptions of consistent patterns of events, and as such, they may serve as a means of controlling human behavior. Listen carefully. A rule may describe a contingency of some sort, and under the right conditions, it may prompt us to behave in a way that is consistent with that contingency. Behavior that is initially governed by a rule also produces consequences, which accumulate their own effects on how we behave. Just because our behavior is consistent with a rule does not mean it is controlled by the rule. It may instead be under control of the history of consequences it has produced. That's why I remembered table manners. So table manners is something I remember learning as a child. It was drilled in me to chew with my mouth closed, to keep my legs down and off the chair, to not make a mess. I can vividly remember learning what's right from what's wrong when it's time to eat. And this is not because of the actual rules that were in place, but because of the contingencies. So I think that's a perfect example, personal connection that I made from that chunk of the chapter. Now to deductive reasoning. Deductive inferences are another set of rules of logic where conjunctions, disjunctions, and implications are three good examples. An example of conjunction would be and. Saying I am friendly and I am hungry connects two propositions that could be said separately. They could be said and accepted separately. Disjunctive propositions connect two propositions with the word or. An example would be we can go here to eat or we can go there. And I think that when you use or as a just disjunctive proposition, it would be more acceptable in this case to the listener, because if you were to say those things separately, it might not make sense. And an implication connects two propositions with if, then, being the most common. If I don't do my homework now, then I won't be able to watch TV later. So these three rules of deductive inferences are important because they give the listener some insight on what it is you're trying to convey. And now we're going to slide into inductive reasoning. Excuse me. Inductive reasoning is about the ways we arrange premises that do not match to the rules of deductive inference. For example, Johnston gives the example of Mills's method. Mills's method of differences is another inductive rule. If a particular phenomenon occurs when only when another event occurs and never in its absence, it may be reasoned that the two events are causally related. Reasoning by analogy is another inductive tactic. For example, if two couples go out for dinner and eat the same items on the menu, and 3 of the 4 get sick, to their stomach later that evening, you might infer that the fourth person is likely to get sick as well. From a behavioral perspective, inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning overlap and offer rules that lead to the listener agreeing. Deductive fallacious reasoning is persuasive and more common than you might think. It's when you get the result you thought you might get based off of something else, but you aren't completely sure if that's the reason why it happened. And you can't fully prove it. So it's a bit confusing, but for example, something is giving you an allergic reaction and you suspect it's the shrimp you ate last night. But because every time you eat shrimp, you break out in hives. But the shrimp wasn't the only thing you ate. So it is possible that it's the shrimp that's causing this allergic reaction, but it's also possible that it could be something else. Johnson says that deductive fallacious is very common, not just among like everyday people, but scientists. And Johnson also says that we must stop viewing reasoning and other verbal behaviors as things that happen mentally because it's not true. That all of these things that we think happen mentally and intellectually are all forms of verbal behavior, and it makes it difficult to measure and develop from a behaviorist point of view. So the question that I came up with, first I want to just mention another quote that Johnson wrote. He says, "It is also important to retrieve reasoning and logic from its traditional interpretation as a mental activity. This explanation supports other misunderstandings." So that just ties in with why we need to stop viewing reasoning as something that's mental and to walk away from this mentalistic point of view and view it as verbal behavior, because that's really what it is. But the question that I pose is, what advice would you give Bridget based off of the chapter and all of this information? In what ways can we develop the reasoning skills among people like Alan? All right, can't wait to read your responses. Bye.